Good afternoon and welcome to this public meeting on the Standing Committee on Government Operations. My name is Caitlin Cleveland and I am the MLA for Cam Lake. Today I am acting chair for the Standing Committee on Government Operations. Today's committee is holding a public hearing about Bill 85, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Implementation Act. This bill is intended to describe the process that the government will follow to ensure that future laws, regulations, and policies implemented by the territorial government are consistent with the human rights set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is committee's job to review the government's bill and make sure it is the best piece of legislation possible for the wants and needs of the people of the Northwest Territories. I'd like to remind all members and witnesses to direct all questions and comments to myself as chair and to wait to be recognized before speaking to help us have a smooth meeting. This will also ensure that our microphones can be tapped into the right stream for the right individual. Please note that this meeting is being live streamed on the Legislative Assembly's social media channels. And I will now turn the microphone and the floor over to my colleagues to have the opportunity to introduce themselves as well. And I will start with our regular chair, MLA Johnson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Rylund Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North. Thank you, Mr. McKay, for joining us today. Apologies we couldn't make it there in person. Committee's travel schedule was interrupted by fires a number of times, and our thoughts and prayers are with everyone currently being evacuated and those who were previously evacuated. But happy to hear from you and glad we arranged this.
Thank you, Emily Johnson. Emily Marcellos.
Emily Marcellos, member for Tabasha. Thank you.
And Emily Semler.
Lisa Semler, MLA for Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Thank you so much, members and colleagues. I'd like to turn the floor over now to Mr. Vince McKay, President of Hay River Metis Local 51. Mr. McKay, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about both of you that have joined us here today, and then please proceed with your presentation. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for the introductions. My name is Vince McKay. I'm the president of the Metis Local 51. With me is Joanne Jensen. She's the executive secretary and treasurer of the Local 51. And today I requested to come to the public meeting to do a little background, if you will, and hopefully some discussion afterwards. So if I may, I'll just go ahead and start.
Absolutely, yes, please. Thank you so much.
Thanks. So the Hay River and Area Metis Local 51 would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak in this public consultation regarding Bill 85, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and Implementation Act. My name is Vince McKay. I am a Cree Métis born and raised in Hay River. I'm the president of the Hay River and Area Metis Local 51, which was established in 1980 under the then NWT Métis Nation. We are here today to address concerning issues that demands your attention and action. We find ourselves in the midst of a troubling situation within the Government of Northwest Territories. It is disheartening to acknowledge that the Métis Local 51 and some Métis people throughout the NWT, an integral part of the Indigenous community, are being left out of GNWT's policies and procedures, ultimately denying them the recognition as an Aboriginal group in the NWT. Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 recognizes and affirms the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Indian, Inuit, Métis people of Canada, however, not in the NWT. Some Métis lose their status as soon as they cross the 60th parallel. The Hay River and Area Métis Local 51 have been passed over for decades, disregarded when it comes to the GNWT programs and services. Only those Métis with Cree, Slavey, Chippewan ancestry who resided in, used, and occupied any part of the NWT on or before December 31st, 1921, or the descendants are favored for GNWT programs and services. It discriminates contrary to Section 6 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the right to move and gain livelihood. Every citizen in Canada and person who has the status permanent residence in Canada has the right to move, to take up residence in any province, and to pursue the gaining of a livelihood in any province. And Section 15, which is the equality of rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It also violates the proposed bill of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in particular under Articles 2, 8, 14, 21. United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People is a historic and a significant document that upholds the rights, dignity, cultural heritage of Indigenous people around the world. It embodies principles such as self-determination, cultural preservation, their rights to participate in decisions affecting their lands and resources. The adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is a significant step towards rectifying the historical injustices suffered by Indigenous communities. Government of Northwest Territories would be hypocritical in enacting this bill unless it includes all Aboriginal groups like the NWT Métis who are currently left out. The enactment of the bill will fail to fully uphold the principles enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People by discrediting the Metis Local 51 and denying them recognition as an Aboriginal group. The government is perpetuating systemic discrimination and further marginalizing an already marginalized group or community. The Métis people have rich and unique cultural heritage that is intertwined in the history of the Northwest Territories and Canada. Their distinct language, customs, and way of life have contributed significantly to the fabric of this region. Yet, despite their undeniable Indigenous identity, they continue to be excluded and denied their rightful place among the recognized Aboriginal groups. This omission not only undermines the principles of the equality and non-discrimination, but also has a far-reaching consequences for all Métis people in the NWT and their ability to exercise their inherent right. Without official recognition, they face barriers accessing essential services, participating in decision-making processes, the preservation of culture practices. This injustice not only hampers their present well-being, but also threatens preservation of their culture, heritage, and for future generations. We must acknowledge the failure to recognize Metis Local 51 is a system that is of a larger problem within our society. The systemic discrimination faced by Indigenous people. This discrimination is rooted in historical injustices, and colonial legacies, continue to perpetuate inequalities, denies Indigenous communities their rightful place in society. It is incumbent upon us as concerned citizens to advocate for the change and demand the government of Northwest Territories rectify this situation. We must urge you to enact Bill 85 to ensure that the Métis Local 51 and all other Métis around the North will be recognized as Indigenous Aboriginal groups in accordance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Canadian Charter of Rights. This recognition is not just a matter of symbolism, fundamental step towards justice, equality, and reconciliation. Furthermore, we must call for an end to systemic discrimination against Indigenous peoples in the NWT. Regardless of their distinct identities or where they reside in Canada, it is our collective responsibility to ensure that the principles of the UN's Declaration on Rights of the Indigenous People are fully implemented, and the rights of all Indigenous communities are protected and respected. Any individual who identifies as Métis, distinct from other Aboriginal peoples in the NWT, and has an ancestral connection to the historic Métis communities and is accepted by modern Métis should be considered in this plan. In this world today, you can identify as whoever and whatever you want. Yet here we are today in front of you all, still fighting to identify and be recognized as Métis in our home country and territory, of which many of us were born in. Let's stand united in our commitment to justice, equality, and the inherent right of the Indigenous people. Together, we can bring about the change that is long overdue, creating society that embraces the values, contributions of all its diverse members, and to be fully in line with United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKay, and thank you very much for your presentation here today to committee. I'd like to open up the floor to questions or comments from my colleagues. Colleagues, does anybody have any questions for Mr. McKay today? Thank you so much. Well, in the meantime, Emily Semler, I think you have your hand up, if I can see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find my mute button. Yes, thank you for your presentation to the committee. I think what I appreciate what you've said in regards to Métis and within UNDRIP. I also, when we did some of the other committee work that we did with the Reconciliation Committee for Indigenous, I believe that, a lot of this kind of topic comes up. It comes up in a lot of discussion when you said that, that you're not getting a lot of equality as Indigenous people when you're Métis, when you don't fall under the federal act as under status Indian, and I always tried to compare it to kind of like, as an Inuvialuit, I'm Inuit, so, but it doesn't matter how far down the line as an Inuit, I'm still Inuit. And so, when you're First Nations and whether you're Métis and you can decide to be, like I know some Métis that are eligible to be status, but they choose to stay as Métis because that's who they represent. That's what they represent as, and that's who they are, and they're still Indigenous. And then we look at the Daniels case where Ottawa, kind of agrees that Métis are Indigenous, but I think sometimes I struggle because we don't have a correlated throughout Canada approach to, because again, there's a divide. I think that problem is whether you're from Manitoba Métis or you're from the North Métis or Alberta. And I think the GNWT has tried to compensate that by providing Métis within the Northwest Territories equivalent benefits under non-insured health, and that's coming from GNWT. But I do appreciate your presentation. I don't really have any questions. I'm glad that you were able to present to this committee because it does give a different perspective. My husband is Métis, and he chooses to continue to be Métis, whether or not he could become status, because that's who he identifies as. So I understand. And trying to make sure that your voice is at the table. And I think that's a struggle sometimes when we are from the outlying communities, we know the ins and outs of the politics and the community levels and the different structures and who represents who. But then when you don't live in those areas and you're more from, like, if you don't live it and breathe it every day, as some of our elected officials, maybe even some cabinet members, maybe, you know, some of the deputy ministers, they don't know they don't see where the gaps are. And I believe that's why it's important that we have to take a look at it and you know, at some point, maybe there's got to be a way that we all fit in there together and support Indigenous, whether you're Métis, Inuit, First Nation, status Indian, you know. So I just want to again thank you for your presentation, and you know, we look forward to the future of how we're going to. This is supposed to be able to change the way we do business in the Northwest Territory. So again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily Semler. Mr. McKay and Ms. Jensen, I'll pass the floor back to yourselves if you want to respond, but no pressure.
Sure, yeah, just wanted to maybe point out one thing, I guess, you know, like, I assume the government of the Northwest Territories did consult with the NWT Métis Nations, which is awesome. I think that's great. However, I don't think the government realizes there's another group of Métis in the Northwest Territories that is not represented by anybody. And that's what I'm pointing out here, I think, is that there's a group of Métis like myself who my family did not reside in the Northwest Territories prior to 1921. However, my dad is a Cree native who transplanted here because of the commercial fishing industry back in the day. And I'll say it like this, unfortunately, but fortunately, I was born in Hay River. I'm born in the north, proud of it. And unfortunately, because of that, I've lost my Métis status or Métis recognition. And just to give you an example, one of my sisters who lives in Alberta, one of their prerequisites of becoming a Métis, they only have one Métis recognition program, if you will. And she only had to reside there for 6 months, and she's now a member of the Alberta Métis Association. And here, that doesn't exist.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKay. Next, I'll pass the floor over to Emily Martselos down in Tavacha.
Thank you for the presentation, Mr. McKay. I think it was very informative. So you're saying that the government of the Northwest Territories doesn't recognize your organization, but the NWT Métis Nation put the terms of reference for recognition at 1921, right? It wasn't the government of the Northwest Territories. Am I correct?
Yeah, so I guess they're, yes, and that would be correct. But I guess I would say that it's also the government of Northwest Territories that accepted that to work with them.
Well, terms of reference were presented by the NWT Métis Nation. Okay, so at some point, and most of the organizations within that group, with the Hay River, the Fort Res, are all understand the terms of reference as 1921, right? And I'm just wondering, how many individuals are we talking about within your organization that are that were not born in the Northwest Territories, or where ancestry doesn't go back to 1921? So how many individuals are we talking about?
In Hay River, there's probably 300 to 500 Métis, and we're trying to get them all registered as Metis Local 51 members. But at this point, a lot of them are, they think, what's the point? We're still working on that, but there is many of us born here, many of us that haven't been born here, and it's somewhere between 300 and 500 people. With their descendants, their children, their grandchildren. Most of us that are in Local 51 that from the beginning all stemmed from the Old Town West Channel area. And yes, the 1921 NWT Métis Nation, they mention that they are Métis due to Treaty 8, which we are also descendants of those Aboriginals from Treaty 8. But they also claim the Dene lineage, which is why they refer to 1921, which Treaty 11 was signed in 1921. So this all started, from my understanding, to do with land claims and other issues, benefits, I'm sure. So we've been told that we've had to separate our group because obviously lots of the 1921 people were our Local 51 members. There are family, cousins, relatives. So we are separated. But that was told to us because the government had instructed that they had to split the membership. Whether that's true or not, I honestly don't know. We're still trying to find out where that come from. Did it come from within our own Métis? Did that come from the government? We're still honestly working on that portion. So yeah, so we imploded some decades ago and reinstated ourselves when we discovered that there was enough of us that wanted to fight for the right to be Métis.
And I guess just to add to that, that's just locally, but I mean, throughout the whole Northwest Territories, there are Métis that are not a part of a recognized group. Fort Smith, Resolution, Klavic, Nuvik, Yellowknife, through the whole Northwest Territories.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jensen. Mr. McKay, I'll pass back to Emily Martellos.
So just for further clarity, so there are two locals in Hay River. There's the one that is represented, that comes under the NWT Métis Nation. And then there's Local 51. Am I correct?
Correct.
Sorry, I guess what it is the new, or the Métis, Northwest Territories Métis Nation covers the Métis of the South Slave region, which is the Métis Government Council, the Fort Smith Métis and Fort Resolution Métis. The old system, which was the Northwest Territories Métis Nation, which encompassed all the locals, and all the locals went throughout the whole Northwest Territories. You know, like Local 21, Local 51, Local 18, all that stuff throughout the Mackenzie Valley, everything like that. That changed in the 90s, late 90s. That being said, everybody that wasn't part of the 1921 establishment have all been essentially left out or signed as part of an Aboriginal group in the region.
So I don't think you made it very clear. Like, are there two locals in Hay River? Because
there's only one. Sorry, Ms. Marcelo. So there's only one local. That's us, Local 51, and we don't belong to any organization. It's one that just established and fell by the wayside.
Okay, so there's also the Hay River Métis Nation, right?
Yeah, Local 51 was the original Métis, encompassing all of us here in Hay River, 51. And the Hay River Métis Government Council, when they separated from Local 51, created that, I believe, in the 90s, Hay River Government Council. So some of our Local 51 members went there because they could prove that they had some ancestry, grandparent linked to having been here in 1921. Having been here.
So who is the president of that local?
I believe it's Mr. Trevor Beck.
Yeah,
local.
that's it. Yeah, Trevor
Yeah.
Beck. So there are two divisions then, okay? Just like the North Slave. You know, a lot of the people in the North Slave Métis are descendants of a lot of the people from the Fort Smith original organization, you know, like the Ingies and the Whitfords, and you know what I mean. So
Yep.
I just want clarification about that, because so there's the organization that are not don't come under the 1921 group, and then there's the group that are saying that they should be part of the 1921 or whatever, and so there are two different organizations in Hay River. Then I did not know that.
We're saying we should be part of the 1921. We respect their position as well. We understand it, but to have the NWT Métis Nation, which only can consist of 1921, that's their rules. Now, you must remember that we used to have the Métis Nation of the NWT many, many years ago, and they let that go to the wayside and created the NWT Métis Nation just to encompass 1921 group. But when you call yourself a Métis Nation, are you really a Métis Nation if you won't include other Métis? They could still be 1921 Hay River, Fort Smith, Fort Res, but they could also still have the other Métis from Hay River, Fort Smith, Fort Res, because all the NWT Métis Nation encompasses is only the South Slave. Doesn't it encompass the North Slave? It doesn't encompass the total Mackenzie Valley.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jensen. Emily Martellus, do you have an additional question?
No, I just want that clarity. I did not know there was two organizations with the Métis in Hay River, and I'm glad I kind of got a bit of I know the terms of reference for belonging to the NWT Métis and the terms of reference for their claim, but I did not know that there was another group, and I'm glad that they presented, so I understand that part also. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Emily Martellus. Mr. McKay, I'll pass back to yourself. Mr. McKay, you're muted.
We're good. Yeah, we're good now. Sorry. I guess just to add to this, we've been working on this for a while and trying to, get our footings back in the ground here, and realizing that there's a lot of Métis that are left out in the Northwest Territories. So we actually changed our name to Local 51 and area, because we didn't want to leave out people that are, like in Fort Smith, for an example, that cannot be part of the NWT Métis Nation or Yellowknife, or the Beaufort Delta area, Mackenzie Valley area. I have reached out to quite a few people. I've had a lot of phone calls from people who are wondering how things are going, and I think for us, we didn't want to leave those people out, and I think it's important to recognize that, although we're saying Hay River, it's the Northwest Territories.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKay. And I think, too, this really speaks to how unique and diverse the Northwest Territories is in this conversation. And so I really want to thank you for both yourself and Ms. Jensen for joining us here today and for doing your presentation. We do really appreciate it. I'm wondering if it's possible for us to get a copy of your speaking notes that you used today sent to committee, if that's okay? Excellent. Thank you so much.
I'll email them.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. And when, we're working our way through committee work, it's always nice to be able to have that information in hand so that we're able to reference back to it and not just the notes that we've each taken here today. I also, and I know that largely our conversation here has been about, membership and the history of the Northwest Territories. And I'm wondering, specific to the pieces within the legislation, around building the committee and prioritizing the pieces from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, if Local 51 does have feedback for committee as far as how that action plan committee is built, or how that those pieces flow forward. If there was anything that you wanted to kind of leave us with today as far as your recommendations for amendments to those pieces, or if those pieces you're largely comfortable with, but I'll pass the floor back to yourself for that one. Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah. No, I reviewed everything, and honestly, I think it's a great document. I think the work's been good, and as I stated in my speech, I support it. I think it's great. It's good to move forward. However, unfortunately, like I said, I feel there's groups being left behind, and I think it'd be very hypocritical for the government to move it forward, even though there's still groups that aren't involved, if you will. But yes, overall, I think it's a good step forward, and the work's been good. You want to add anything? No.
Well, thank you so much, and we really appreciate your willingness to not only be here in person today, but also share your speaking notes with us via email. We really appreciate that, and we appreciate both of your time here today. So thank you so much, and thank you as well to the public who has joined us here today as well. I think it's really important for not only us within committee here, but also for the public to be able to be privy to these conversations and to really have the opportunity to learn from them. So thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Excellent. With that, committee, can I please have a motion for us to move in camera? Thank you very much, MLA Semler. And thank you both to yourself, Mr. McKay, and Ms. Jensen, for your time here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll see.